you for joining our virtual training insights using the MBTI assessment with Dispersed Teams webinar. My name is Kim Rivera, Associate Marketing Manager here at CPP, and I will be moderating today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 1 hour, and in the last 10 minutes of the presentation, Sherrie and Rich will be answering your questions. So start thinking about what you may want to ask, and please submit them to me at any time using the question function in the webinar controls. Please note this webinar is being recorded and will be sending out an email with link to the recording and presentation slides in the next few days. Now, I'm very happy to welcome our speakers, Sherrie, Haynie, and Rich Thompson. Sherrie Haynie is the Director of Professional Services at CPP and leads the company's consulting efforts. She has expertise in leadership development, strategic planning, and performance management with the focus on organizational results. Sherrie has worked with executives and senior leadership teams to transform work groups into high-performing teams. Our second speaker, Rich Thompson, is a Senior Director of Research at CPP and leads the company's research efforts worldwide and provides strategic input on cross-functional product development efforts. Rich has an extensive background in developing surveys and assessments for use in both organizational information gathering and predictive research. Okay, so let's start by welcoming Sherrie and Rich. I'll turn it over to you guys now.
All right, thanks, Kim, and thanks, everyone. This is Rich Thompson speaking. Sherrie and I will be trading back and forth as far as speaking duties go. During this webinar, we're trying to accomplish a few different things. First of all, and I think the reason most folks are here, is to learn a little bit about virtual training best practices and MBTI type considerations for those, including some tips on how to take MBTI type preferences into account when developing virtual training for any topic really, but also for type related trainings as well. As part of the presentation, we have a series of poll questions. For each of those, you'll be given about 15 seconds to quickly answer a very simple question. We'll then kind of go back and forth between the slideshow and the polling function, where we'll show the question and then we'll show the results, and then we'll give you the results that we found based on a CVP survey that we conducted for this project. And then at the end, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions about challenges you face when you're delivering virtual trainings to see if we can all educate each other about the best ways to do this. So what I want to talk about first is the survey that we're using to drive some of the results that we're presenting here. And we conducted a survey of people who had completed the MBTI, and we sent out an invitation. So they've completed the MBTI, and we know something about their type. And we sent out an invitation to have them fill out this virtual work survey. We had about 2,000 people complete it, and of those, 60% were female, which is what we typically find on CPP surveys that we do. They represent mostly folks who are in management and non-supervisory positions, which is also very typical of our samples. The average age of the respondent was 41, and you can see the ethnic breakdown there. Again, given these are people who've completed the MBTI, very similar to what we typically see for people who use the MBTI. And in terms of their occupation, you see that most of them are in education, business and finance, and management. So again, very typical of what we see from people who typically take the MBTI. I share that with you only because it's a compulsion of mine, given I do research, and people often want to know a little something about the sample. I will say that the first poll question, however, is actually not based on this survey. It is based on our archival data, where we had 600,000 people who had answered a question about the degree to which they work from a home or remote office. And so, with that in mind, we'll ask the first question, which is, what percentage of employees do you think or guess work remotely full-time? Is it 5%, 15%, or 45%? Kim will invoke the poll, and we'll see what you guys think. Again, if you would just quickly answer the poll, tell us what you think, and then we'll get to the actual, what the data says. So 66% of you said 15%, 10% of you said 45%, 24% of you said 5%. And so the survey says, you can see here, this is our distribution based on the question, what percentage of time do you work in your home or remote office? And there was about 20% of you who were right. It comes to about 5% of people who indicated they spend 91 to 100% of their time working virtually. So fairly accurate guesses, but a key takeaway of that is that we spent a lot of time trying to figure out early on what are the actual numbers. And what we found was that much of what we see in the popular press is driven from one or two studies done by this global workplace analytics organization, and they're largely driving the results that's out there in terms of how much people are working from home from one item on a U.S. Census survey, not the census, but these surveys that they do every 6 months to 2 years. And what they found is that in terms of the question that they actually ask is, how do you get to work? And people say, I don't commute. And that's the question they use to drive a lot of what's going on in the media. What they did find from that question, though, is that working from home is growing rapidly. A small percentage of the workforce works at home half-time or more, and it is growing fairly quickly. The data that we have is actually, I think, better than much of what's out there, and I'll let Sherrie talk briefly about the implications.
Hello, everyone. So this definitely is insightful information for those of us in the training and development field, and we're looking at the data as a great way to identify how much of our efforts should be focused towards virtual training platforms. And what we found based on this data is the request for virtual training is arisen from lack of travel budget or time away from the office that's required for face-to-face training, the demands of balancing the time and attention. So we found that it's not because that large percentage of people are working remotely full-time, because it is about 5% who are remote full-time. They're in the office, they have the flexibility to be in the office. However, it is these other constraints that really feed towards the need to have virtual training as an option. So it's the considerations of needing to balance travel and budget that where we really see the greatest demand for virtual training. So that leads us into the next question. So our next poll question. Most people who work from home have a preference for introversion. Do you believe this is a myth or a fact? So if you'll take a moment to vote. We'll take a look at our results now. Do most people have a preference for introversion? And the answer is that is a myth. So if we will look at our CPP results, I believe, Rich, you're taking it from here.
Yep, so very smart and astute audience. That is in fact a myth. As I've already noted, most people don't actually work from home, and hopefully you can see my cursor, but for those people who do work from home, which is a small percentage, it's actually more likely, ever so slightly more likely to be extroverts rather than introverts who work from home. And when we look at all four of the MBTI preferences, you can see that the typical person who works from home, when you combine the preferences, is an E and an S, although slightly by 0.4, F and J, so an ESFJ. If you look at who's most likely to be in an office, which really was surprising to us when we looked at the results, it was actually an INFP. So this just gives you a flavor for how the type distribution breaks out in terms of working from home. Thought it might be a surprise to you all, but obviously you're very clever. And then this is the distribution of whole types, because people often want to look at that in terms of working at home. And again, you see this overwhelming majority of people spend less than 10% of their time working virtually. When we look at whole types, we see that the ESFJs, which is what we saw in the preferences, are most likely to work from home, and a tie between the ISFPs and the ISFJs in terms of second, most likely to be working from home. So I'll throw it back to Sherrie for some implications on that.
So how does this play out in our world when we are designing training, we're looking at ways to alter our delivery methods? What this information tells us is we don't need to tailor virtual training for specific MBTI types any differently than we would tailor our training for face-to-face training. So what we find is equally we need to have balanced design that will address the needs of all types. So there is not an overwhelming MBTI type preference that we really need to cater to for virtual training. So the research really supports our design methods, and we need to treat it similarly to having an equal distribution of MBTI types that you would have virtual versus in-person. We'll look now at our next question. So during virtual training, people who prefer extraversion strongly endorse the value of having camera capability to see others. You will vote when we see our poll pop up. Do you think that is a myth or a fact? So let's reveal that that is a myth. So if we will look at your results, looks like we did trick a few of you this time. So we've actually found, based on the research, that it is a myth, that we don't necessarily see an overwhelming number of those with an extroversion preference prefer camera capability. So our data, we actually find that 24% would prefer it, that have an extroversion preference, 15% with an introversion preference, but it's not an overwhelming number. So we still have 75% that feel that it's not necessarily a valuable feature. That's important because many of us want to have all the bells and whistles when we create virtual training. So we want to make sure that we balance the bells and whistles with the actual content. So having all of the capabilities in play is not necessarily going to improve the learning impact for your participants. So moving now into best practices. So the implications of when we're creating virtual training, the balancing act between using the features and maintaining an impact on your learning. So back to the appreciation of designing virtual training so that all 16 types have an opportunity to learn best. So we're going to go through each preference pair and look at the implications for virtual training. The idea is when you step back and look at your design, you need to account for both introversion and extraversion. So you will have participants that have both preferences based on our research. And if you consider the needs of both and you balance your design by including an opportunity for those with a preference for introversion to reflect, they need to develop internal ideas. So if you can send out pre-work or give them reading assignments ahead of time before the training, that gives them an opportunity to be at their best and ready to contribute during the training. They need to ponder thoughts so that they can contribute during the training. In contrast, those with a preference for extraversion, they often do their best work when they have discussion and interaction. So if you build in chat opportunities, whiteboards, open the mic if you can for interaction, and allow them that opportunity to discuss and have their ideas evolve during the training, then they can be at their best as well. So having a balance between the needs of those with an introversion and an extroversion preference will give you the greatest learning opportunity for both. So we'll take a look now at sensing and intuition. If you think about the needs of those with a sensing preference, they like to hear practical applications. And often in the Myers-Briggs content areas, we have a lot of focus on the theory. So the more you present practical applications and specific examples, those with a sensing preference will feel that they are truly having a learning experience that meets their needs. Tell stories about real-life experiences. So give examples that are clear and concrete, and how this worked in the past. Give some examples of how your concepts were successful with others. And don't overuse the tools. So rather than showing off the bells and whistles of your platform, make sure that the learning is front and center so it doesn't detract. Those with a preference for introversion, they need to see the big picture. They want to have a framework. What is the purpose of this training? Where are we going with this? And don't overload with too many details. Also give them some flexibility in how they learn. You may provide breakout rooms. You may provide other creative ways where they can research. You might give them a question that they have to research and then come back together with small groups within a training. So again, a balance between the needs of those with a sensing preference as well as intuition will give you a great way to balance out sensing and intuition. Looking now at thinking and feeling. Those with a thinking preference, they want to see the logical reasons for your exercises. So exercises for the sake of going through the motions will be frustrating. They need to see how it is going to impact their learning. They may ask a lot of questions. So make sure there's space for questions and challenges to the content. Build in room for debate. You may have discussion boards, chat rooms, that they like to debate the ideas and consider the pros and cons. Those with a preference for feeling, they often provide feedback that it's difficult to maintain relationships or build relationships during virtual training. So make sure that the virtual training includes time to connect before the session, time to follow up after the session so that they can build meaningful relationships. Create learning groups, action learning groups, so that they have an opportunity to connect either through a Skype video session or by sharing photos so that they have some sort of interpersonal connection with their cohort. And next we will take a look at judging and perceiving. So similar to face-to-face training, you need to have an agenda, you need to have a time frame, and make sure that that is shared with the participants so that they know what the goals are, what's the plan. And the distraction can be frustrating when they move in and out of exercises if it's not following the agenda. So make sure you stick to the agenda and have areas where you capture information and you can refer back to it. So continue to follow the timeline with virtual training in the same way you would with face-to-face. At the same time, those with a preference for perceiving may do their best work when they have an opportunity to be spontaneous and enjoy the process in the moment. So create that space, build it into the agenda. So it seems almost a dichotomy. How do you do one and the other at the same time? So if you build into the agenda an opportunity for spontaneous brainstorming so they can share ideas and information when it arises, then you can suit the needs of both those with a judging and a perceiving preference. Have a parking lot, whether it's a whiteboard or an area particular to your platform, where you can capture ideas that may come up in the moment and you can explore it further so you're able to stay with your agenda.
Okay, thanks, Sherrie. So this leads us to our next poll question, and that is, during virtual training, most people with a preference for extraversion find group discussion a lot more useful than those with a preference for introversion. Is that a myth or a fact? And we'll pull up the poll. Okay. Hopefully you've got your answers in. Let's see what the results say. So 60% of you said that's a myth, and the survey says that is in fact a fact. So waiting for my screens to catch up here, it's a fact. Percentage of people who find group discussion useful, 70% of people with an E preference said group discussions were helpful. Perhaps surprising is that even 53% of those with an I preference said that group discussions are helpful. For the other preferences, and the reason we're doing so much on E and I in the poll is there were no differences for the other three preferences. Back to Sherrie for what that might mean.
So we have many different methodologies to teach content, to deliver different areas of content when we are delivering virtual training. What we have found is to break it up and provide video and discussion as a nice way to have not just your voice be heard, but also different methodologies. This is actually an example of a video that we have at CPP. It goes through, it's a 15-minute video, and it's an introduction to the MBTI preferences. So I've used this. It's a great way to show short segments. And after the participants view the segment, it's a description of type and action. Then I will bring up an exercise in a virtual training platform. And this particular example would be a whiteboard where they can write on the interactive feature which character did you most relate to. So it's just a nice way to input video in addition to the other methodologies in your actual training.
Okay, and that leads us to the next question. Again, waiting for the screens to catch up. That question is, people with a preference for sensing find self-paced training modules much more valuable than those with a preference for intuition. So we'll see if that's a myth or a fact. Okay, and so we'll see what you all thought. So for that question, people with a preference for sensing find self-paced training modules more valuable. 64% of you said you thought it was a myth, and you are in fact correct. So in this area, only 30 I guess we did something wrong here.
No, you're good. So the concept here is there's often an assumption that if you prefer sensing, you may prefer this self-paced module approach. And what we found is it's actually an extraversion and introversion impact. That we found 39% of extraversion preference like the self-paced. So it's more of an impact on extraversion and introversion, and not at all as sensing and intuition. So that was an interesting finding as opposed to what our assumption was going into the research.
And this is why we have Sherrie here. I'm clearly not that helpful. Thank you, Sherrie, you're right. Okay, so Sherrie, if you just press on with the implications of that question.
So to further elaborate on that, we have the risk of stereotyping, those of us in the MBTI practitioner world. And we might make assumptions based on what we think we know about people and their MBTI type preferences. So this research is a great reminder that, for example, just because you prefer sensing does not necessarily mean that you need a linear self-paced training module, more so than those with an intuition preference. So keep in mind that whatever your assumptions might be, MBTI type is only one part of who we are, and virtual training taps into many other aspects about ourselves as people and as learners and our learning styles. So we need to be very sensitive to what our needs are overall and keep that balanced approach covering all preferences in your training, not just what you think might be a majority of your attendees.
Okay, and see if I can do this one correctly. So next question for the poll. So is it a myth or a fact that 45% of people would choose a virtual training over in-person training if given the choice? So we'll open up that poll. Please select an answer. Okay, and so 56% of you said that it was a fact that 45% of people would choose virtual training over in-person training if given a choice. And if my screens are catching up, this one we again tricked you a little bit. That is in fact a myth. About half of people prefer in-person, regardless of type, and another almost 40 to 50% prefer a combination based on the question of virtual and in-person, and very few people would choose virtual if given a choice. When we asked based on type preferences, you can see there is a difference between extroversion and introversion. 5.6% of E's said they would prefer virtual, and 11.4% of I's said they would prefer it, but it's certainly not an overwhelming preference. And the takeaway from that really to us is that there's a real value proposition of virtual training for organizations and for people. Early on, we talked about the challenges of time, just the cost, the expense of travel, the time away from family and from work. But it certainly seems that based on our data in the survey and just talking to people at different trainings and conferences, that training somehow is always just, that face-to-face element always makes it better. And so that's why, you know, a full-on face-to-face training or some sort of blended training seems to be preferred by most people. The blended trainings, from our experience and from some of the survey results, suggest that what people like about that is having that ability to learn at your own pace and have some time to spend with the material for those who actually do. Sherrie talked earlier about the people with the sensing and the introversion preferences. Sometimes they like to have that time ahead to, you know, read, think about stuff, prepare questions, get ready for the session, and you don't necessarily get that if you walk in cold to a face-to-face. But the beauty of the blended is that they have that time to do the prep work, and then they also get the face-to-face interaction, which everyone, regardless of their type, seems to enjoy. So moving on to the next question. Virtual training requires different course objectives than does in-person training. Is that a myth or is that a fact? We'll open that poll up again for a little bit. Okay. So the poll results suggest that an overwhelming percentage of you indicate that that is in fact a myth, and you are correct. That is a myth. The course objectives can stay the same, and as we've alluded to and talked about, it's really about being planful for your delivery method and the work that you need to do on the exercises to make them fit virtually and hopefully fit different type preferences that needs to change. Oops. Throw it over to Sherrie for some comments on that.
So when we sign up for virtual training, everyone has their own private conversation in their head. What is this going to be about? What am I signing up for? Is it required? And we really have typically a similar fear. So when we think about what we are afraid of, what we are signing up for virtual training, we find that it is the common death by PowerPoint. So there's a difference between clicking through a PowerPoint or observing a webinar presenter just click through a PowerPoint without interaction. So that tends to be one way. That's not really training if there's no interaction. So what we're presenting here today is in a webinar format with a very large group of people. To really differentiate the definition of virtual training, you would want a similar group size to a face-to-face training. So we're presenting a webinar for you. However, a virtual training, I would recommend no more than 25 people and have interactive features included. So the goal is not just a download of information, it's to have that interaction in a way as similar as you would experience live. For example, the polling features, which we have demonstrated here today, is a simple way to maintain engagement, having the participants participate and check their knowledge. So it's a great warm-up, or you can have it as a way to disperse activities throughout. So that's just one of many features, and you may have various platforms with features that you can explore. So in summary, we found that the research on those who work at home versus those who work at home part-time versus having an office to go to, the full-time virtual worker is still a relatively small number of people. So it's an interesting insight for us, and it's not necessarily indicative of how many people sign up for virtual training. So virtual training has come to life as more of a requirement of budget and travel needs as opposed to people who just strictly work from home. So we design training for face-to-face with objectives. You can take that same training and with the same objectives, redesign exercises and activities through a virtual training platform so that you can accomplish the same task. You just use different methodologies. And the most important aspect is you do not need to tailor your virtual training experience to any particular type. We have found that you have the same distribution in a virtual training experience as you would face-to-face. So the learning is make sure that there's something for all types, balance out the needs of each of the preferences, and you will have a great learning experience for all.
All right, thank you both to Sherrie and Rich. I have some questions here that have come through, and there is still time to submit any questions you may have through the webinar controls. First, it's more of a comment that is, I think, good to share with everyone based on some of the content that was that we went through today. As someone with a preference for introversion, I benefit immensely from the other people discussing the details of something. Just because I'm not ready to process out loud about the content, I still need the stimulation of other people and their interactions with one another. So I think that's a good comment and perspective based on what was shared earlier around people, those who have preferences for introversion. And I have now a question from Kimberly. What does blended training entail? How does that practically look?
Well, if you think about blended training, it is a combination of face-to-face. It could be, for example, you have a 2-month program. So blended training could include face-to-face. It could include self-paced learning modules, virtual workshops that are live and interactive, action learning groups, coaching. So it's a variety of different methodologies to ensure that you have covered all of the bases and everyone has an opportunity to learn in the best way possible.
All right. What are some ways to positively implement virtual engagement in a verifying type group setting with only 45 minutes?
The recommendation I have is to have an introduction information session at the very beginning of your program. So above and beyond that 45-minute session, and you could actually have this as a recorded introduction, so it's not required to log into at a certain time, and provide the mind setting and instructions. So set the stage. What's the purpose of the participants going through this process? Help them to understand the mindset that they need to be in when they answer the questions. And we do have a mind setting video at CPP that is free. And actually, Tim, I'll make a note for you to possibly include that with the notes here. So make sure that they have the proper instructions. I also recommend MBTI Complete, and that provides the interactive learning experience in an online module that walks through the definitions, allows the process of self-selection, and gets you closer to the best fit type before your 45-minute session. That's not a lot of time to accomplish that full self-awareness experience that we would necessarily have in a half-day or a full-day session. So if you can do that as pre-work and then use your 45 minutes to go through descriptions, exercises, and the goal for the end of the 45 minutes would be to ensure that people are comfortable that they've arrived at their best fit type and they use that 45 minutes more productively than just starting from scratch. So that's my recommendation, is to incorporate the MBTI Complete into a virtual training experience.
Okay, next question. How do clarity of preference scores factor into your research/implications? Simply stated, all E's are not equal. An E with a 2 clarity is not as strong as an E with a 30. Similarly, the step 2 results yield even more detailed possibilities for understanding.
I'll take that one. So that's a bit of a misunderstanding of what the purpose of the preference clarity index. Type theory is that we have dichotomies and people are either an E or an I, and there's not degrees of E or I-ness. You're an E or you're an I, and all I's are similar in some respects, and that's where the step 2 comes in, and that they can differ based on the facet. The preference clarity index really is an attempt to show how consistently people answered the questions with people who are known to be E's or known to be I's. So it's not about how strong of an E you are, how much E-ness you exhibit. It's about, are you a clear E based on your responses, or are you a less clear E based on your responses? So it's really about the responses to the assessment, not the quality or the quality of with which you display E or I characteristics. So that's the first bit of that. And so to answer the second bit, is we don't take the PCI into account typically when we're doing our research. Typically what we ask people is, do you remember your best fit type? And so that's, they have to kind of, they have to commit to remembering, and then we ask them how confident they are in it. And so when people say they're not confident, we end up throwing them out of the research. So when we're doing these kinds of analyses, we're not looking at PCI. We're looking at whether or not you have this preference or that preference, that you accurately recall it and are confident that you have it.
Okay, great. Lucy has a clarification question, I think, for you, Sherrie. Is it preferable for virtual trainings to have no more than 25 people, or did she mishear? Can you confirm?
That's correct. And that number is based on a couple of different factors. Number one, many of the virtual training platforms that have the interactive features have a maximum class size of 25. And that's based on understanding and research about how much interaction you can expect in a group size. So very large groups, you would have difficulty operating chat rooms or breakout rooms. It would be very difficult to manage. It's also just a best practice for any sort of training that if you have one facilitator to a classroom size of greater than 25, you just have less opportunity for answering questions and interacting with the facilitator.
All right. And Sherrie, are you able to share where you can find the videos that you had referenced in the presentation and what videos those were?
So that is actually a product. That's a CPP product, and it is called the MBTI, Introduction to MBTI Preferences video. I believe it's $149. So it is on the CPP website.
All right. How would you conduct small group discussions, like grouping introverts or extroverts to identify questions for the other group?
I'm not sure I understand that question as far as grouping. I will take a stab at my recommendation, but I'm not quite clear of the question. If you are preparing groupings for exercises, if you're wanting to show differences between introversion and extroversion, for example, you could, if you have 50% of each in your audience, you could divide them out so that you do have an even distribution as best as possible per grouping. It may also be that the goal of your exercise is to have type-alike groups where they share with each other in a small breakout room, and then they come back to the whole group and compare and contrast their answers. So it really depends on the specific purpose of the exercise, and you would then decide what grouping would make best use of that content.
All right. If that didn't answer, please feel free to go ahead and submit a follow-up to that. But the next question is, going through the 4 MBTI dichotomies via PowerPoint can feel like an overload of info. Are there CPP resources for doing this in a more engaging way?
Absolutely. So the MBTI Complete is designed to really assist you with your virtual training. The MBTI Complete includes the basic Form M 93 questions. So in the same format that you would experience as you already utilize it, the participant would answer the 93 items. After that, they would be prompted to go through an interactive learning module. So with this interactive learning module, it is designed to go through the ethical best fit process that's required. So they would be introduced to the preference pairs and asked to self-select. This would happen through each dichotomy pair. And then once they have their self-selection, they are then presented their reported type. So it mimics the same process that you would follow face-to-face to provide an ethical feedback session. That then will save time when you are in your virtual training. You've gone through this interactive learning module, and they arrive at a best fit type. You use your guided expert during this virtual training to ensure that they've arrived at their best fit type. If not, then it's an opportunity for them to explore interactively with the facilitator and other participants. Often they may have that aha moment during the session, and it's perfectly fine if they decide their best fit type is something different at the end of the virtual session, but it will definitely save you time to use the interactive learning module, which is part of the MBTI Complete.
Okay, thank you. Do you find it's helpful for any types to get slides ahead of time, or would that make people less engaged? Could you only send those to those with eye preferences, possibly?
I think this is a great question, and it also helps us come back to the topic of, are we biased towards certain types and assume that only those with eye preference might need slides ahead of time? So that's a great question and a great way to think about what is the purpose of the course, what are our learning objectives. So you wouldn't want to send your full slide deck because you're probably giving away poll questions and that sort of thing. But what I would do is definitely have pre-work and keep in mind the needs of all types. types. So those with a judging preference definitely want to see the agenda, the goal, the plan, the time slot. And also for type-specific training, having some pre-reading, maybe a bit about the MBTI purpose, and have the mind-setting instructions, make sure that as pre-work to actually taking the assessment, they understand that this is not about identifying what they do. This is about identifying what their preferences are, their natural interests. So the pre-work really should focus on getting them prepared to take the assessment. And then if you choose the MBTI complete, that again can be part of the pre-work. So I would not recommend sending out your full slide deck regardless of who your audience is.
Okay, next question. Do certain types multitask more during virtual training, and how do you help prevent this for any particular type?
All types multitask, and unless you have a webcam in their office or home office, there's likely not a way to police that. I think the best way to address that is to make sure that the right motivations are in place to complete or participate in this training. If it is a compliance training, it's something that they have to check off of their list. We are all human, we're all busy, and we will all multitask. So that's a fact. There's no way around that. But if the right motivations are in place, if people feel that I'm actually going to learn something, I'm going to get something out of this, they will be more influenced to participate and be engaged. So I think the more homework you do ahead of time to identify what do they need, are you actually providing training that solves a challenge that they have, you will be more likely to have that engagement level if the training suits a purpose and it has a specific need.
Okay, we have a question on the recommended, as we've heard, best practice to wait 10 seconds for people with preference for introversion to wait 10 seconds for them to respond without their basically the question is, how do you wait 10 seconds for those with preferences to introversion to respond without there being an awkward silence during a virtual training?
If there is, we'll use our polling as an example that we did here today. So we actually had 10 seconds built in, but it wasn't just an awkward pause. We were talking during the 10 seconds, talking about the question, reading the question, and there's also still content on the screen. So it feels as if we give that respectful 10 seconds to those with a preference for introversion, but we're also continuing to keep the momentum.
Okay, this is more on the technology side. Do you have any recommendations on the best virtual training tools to use? One that you mentioned that would have whiteboards and or breakout rooms.
There are many, many platforms out there. GoToTraining, WebEx, Zoom, Adobe Connect. There are many, many platforms, so I recommend working with your IT department to identify what platform they support and consider your audience. Are they using mobile phones, smartphones? Would they all be logging in from a computer? So there are many technical requirements that you need to consider and work closely with your IT department to select the one that will work best for your audience.
Is there any specific MBTI pre-reading you would recommend prior to virtual trainings?
It depends on the content you plan to present. If it is a basic introduction to Myers-Briggs, you can provide an overview of your goals and objectives for the session and the mindset instructions, and get them excited about learning what their natural preferences are. You don't want to overwhelm them too much with too much pre-reading if it's a very introductory phase. If this is later in their learning, if they've gone through the session and they know their MBTI preference, and now you plan to focus on something like communication or conflict or managing change, we have many booklets that are available either PDF or hard copy. So you may want to actually provide a resource ahead of time that gives them an opportunity to plan questions. For an introductory, I would just provide the basic instructions and really get them excited about the value of learning their MBTI preference.
All right. Do you have any exercise examples for virtual and in-person combination trainings?
Everything typically is custom based on the audience we're working with, the platform we're using, the goals and objectives. So we don't actually have a kit that is for sale with ready-to-go exercises because there are so many various needs to consider technology-wise and what your goals and objectives are. So my recommendation is to take your basic slide deck that you would use for in-person, identify what segment of that you would have time to present, what are your goals and objectives. I would recommend no more than 90 minutes for a session without a break, and identify if you have a half-day workshop, you might need to have 2 or 3 virtual sessions to accomplish all of those objectives. And the next step would be to look at your platform, what features are available, and from there you can then redesign some of the exercises to fit the platform you've selected.
Okay, thank you, Sherrie. I have a lot of questions that have come in that are very more product-specific questions, and what I want to recommend to the audience here is to email us if you have a specific product question at custserv@cpp.com. That's CUSTSERV, short for customer service, at cpp.com. And that way you can get very specific details around any product that was mentioned or that you have more questions about. And we will also try to provide some links in the follow-up email that will go out later this week or early next week. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and be on the lookout for that follow-up email with the recording slides and some of the follow-ups that we discussed throughout the webinar. So thank you both, Sherrie and Rich.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.